Okay, we started we ended with Elegy, and this was a book that was published at the beginning of 2016. But as Trump became more and more likely to be the candidate of the Republican Party, and then the president, and then after he was president, people really started to wonder what happened. And the book they turned to really explain all of this was J.D. Vance's book called Hillbilly Elegy, which was published in early 2016. J.D. Vance grew up in Appalachia. He then went to the military, served 4 years in the military, used his GI Bill to go to Ohio, Ohio, the Ohio State University. But from there, he went to Yale Law School. So he's been like inducted into the elite of the world. Um, and when he would tell stories, people would be sitting around talking about their childhoods. The people at his school were just absolutely fascinated by his life story. I mean, he felt like he might as well say that he grew up on the moon. I mean, that their experiences and his experiences growing up were so different. And because of these shocks, one of his professors, Amy Chua, who is became known in the Kavanaugh hearings, one of his professors urged him to write a book and kind of serve as the translator for Appalachia America to the rest of America. And this idea that the rural areas are different and maybe even not the same America starts to play out. Okay, I think there's a whose book that says wherever you go, there you are. I'm kind of doing a riff on this. Wherever you go, there you, meaning people who are just like you, are. And so we see over the last 30 years or so, areas becoming increasingly homogenous. In terms of race, 40% of the cities lost whites to suburbs in this period. And the urban whites the urban people who moved to cities tended to move to a handful of high-tech cities. So you were way more likely to move to San Francisco than you were to move to Cincinnati. Another kind of thing that added to the sorting was age. Prior to 1990, roughly equal distribution of people across the ages across the country. But after 1990, young people began to move to cities, and rural areas became older on average. And so, by the end of the 1990s, rural areas were significantly older average population than, especially high tech cities. Another kind of factor is that is education. The young, highly educated people had to move farther away than young, less educated people, because in rural areas, the kinds of jobs that require college educations just aren't there. And so you can say people who move away are more ambitious, but the reality is that if your hometown is something you value, then getting a college education is actually is not rational, because it means giving up what you value most. So these things become self-reinforcing. Now, like-minded people have always clustered together to some degree or other. I mean, this is why we have Chinatown, because this is where people of Chinese origin clustered together and lived. Similarly, Little Italy and first and second generation Italian immigrants. It's not just a national origin or race, though. The city of Loma Linda in the Inland Empire is made up almost entirely of Seventh-day Adventists. And I lived there very briefly. I lived in an apartment community. It was really weird, where half of the apartment community was in Redlands and half was in Loma Linda. At the time, because Seventh Day Adventists have Saturday as their holy day, at the time, Loma Linda had an exemption where they didn't get mail delivered on Saturday; they got it delivered on Sunday. And so in my community, when I was like picking out an apartment, they said, well, you can live in this one, and it's on the Redlands side, and you can live in this one, it's on the Loma Linda side. And I said, what's the difference? And they said, do you want your mail on Saturday or Sunday? And so you end up with this where people have always clustered together. And these clusters of people draw like-minded individuals. If you're Seventh Day Adventist, there's living in Loma Linda is really good. You have the churches that you want. You have the health food stores, because many Adventists don't eat any meat; they're vegetarians, and so you have that kind of community support for your life. But what happened is that, so these clusters have always happened, but what happened is that the nature of clusters change. And one of the things we can look at is changed in terms of our overall values, our overall thinking that our neighbor that our neighbor was just as American as we were. Um, One big factor was the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. Prior to 1965, the immigration policy of the United States favored European immigration. After this reform in 65, many more of our new immigrants were not from Western Europe, and this started kind of changing the demography of the country. And when the people coming in are the same people who your ancestors and their ancestors were lived next door to each other, it provides a different kind of context for immigration than when you don't know anything about somebody from El Salvador or from China or from Korea, and it raises kind of levels of concern. And so today this language has gotten to the point where it's so hateful. We use terms like anchor babies and birthright citizenship and things like that our discourse. Another kind of example of this is what happened in the civil rights movement. Prior to the civil rights movement, there was far more racial segregation in our country. And so when we think back to these glory days of the 1950s and 1960s, and we say we were much more homogenous in values, and it didn't matter whether you were a factory worker or a clinical psychologist. Part of what we're saying is that the people who lived next to us, even if they weren't like us professionally, were a lot like us in many other ways. Another kind of rare to all of this is that we now live in what we call the innovation economy. Manufacturing left the U.S. for lower wage countries, and this is accelerated by the NAFTA treaty. And 30% of the wage difference in the U.S. So if you are in a area that has a high income and an area that has a low income, 30% of the reason that your incomes differ is because of the number of or is tied to the number of patents produced in that region. And so you can see the economic impact of being part of the innovation economy. Here's two examples of that. In 2000, the average salary in Western Nebraska was $19,000 a year, whereas in the California Bay Area, it was $52,000 a year. Now, I get that this was a generation ago, but those trends have only accelerated. Another kind of aspect to this is that corporations wanted to move to places where they could hire employees. Either there was a large employee base there already that they could tap into, or there was a situation where they'd be able to recruit people. So if you're going to Carnegie Mellon, Caltech, Harvey Mudd, and MIT, that's where you want to draw your employees from, you're much more likely to draw them to the Silicon Valley. You're much more likely to draw them someplace like Boston, Denver, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. Those are, New York City. Those are the kind of places where people who have choices like to live. And so we end up developing economies of creative classes and economies of working and service classes, which leads to further sorting. A really good example of this is Amazon's headquarters 2, which was, all the rage 2 years ago. So Amazon needed to create a second headquarters, and they put out a request for proposals, and over 200 cities, communities in the country responded and said, "Come here." Well, Amazon announced some of the things that they were looking for. They were looking for that there was multiple individual buildings, office buildings in the town of more than 500,000 square feet. If you figure an average house is 2,000 square feet, you can do the math. It's like 25 average houses stacked on top of each other. They also wanted at least 8 million square feet of offices. So it wasn't enough to have one big building. You had to have a lot of lots of types of buildings. Within 30 miles, they had to be within 30 miles of a major metropolitan center and within 45 minutes of an international airport. It needed to have a stable, business friendly regulation and taxes. They said that they were going to prioritize areas with strong universities. They wanted mass transit and well developed highways. They wanted to see what cultural fit there was, and there wanted to be an underlying community, a sense of community, and a high quality of life. And there were several places around the country that put in bids that really met all of these qualifications. Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina. This is the research triangle where Duke and University of North Carolina are. Atlanta, Georgia, another place that really ticks all the boxes. Columbus, Ohio, a really up and coming city in the Midwest. And Amazon eventually decided to split their new headquarters between New York City and Northern Virginia. In other words, they went to places where they felt like they could staff a company because these places were very liberal in orientation. And so what we do see is that high tech cities tend to be more liberal, manufacturing cities tend to be more conservative. And the elite class was really slow to see what had happened and why there was a geographic divergence. And so they were shocked when Trump won the manufacturing dominating states.